It's time now for Korea Book Club, our weekly segment where we dive into the world of Korean literature and books, exploring works in Korean and in English translations as well. With us this week, we have cultural essayist Colin Marshall, host of the podcast Colin의 한국, and author of the essay collection 한국 유학 금지. Colin, hello. It's great to see you again.
Hey, Jong-ho. Glad to be here.
Okay, so today you've brought in a new novel by a writer who may not be as well known as Hangang, the Nobel laureate we celebrated a few weeks ago, but she does still have a very devoted fan base herself, right?
That's true. The book would be 속삭임, 우묵한, 정원, the new novel from Bae Suah, whose name may sound familiar even to listeners who mainly read Korean literature in English, or only in English, because in the past decade, she's had quite a few books published in translation, under the titles Nowhere to be Found, A Greater Music, North Station, Recitation, and most recently, Untold Night and Day. And the reviews in the Western press tended toward the laudatory about these books, although it was also clear, to me anyway, that they didn't quite know what to make of her work. The Guardian actually published 2 pieces on Untold Night and Day, one of which described it as a novel in which, and I quote, the amorphous logic of memory or dream, where things are both familiar and strange, connects physical and intangible worlds. The second piece called it, quote, a hallucinatory novel propelled by the logic of dreams. The story resists conventional categorization and coherence in favor of instability, a shamanistic borderland of feverish disintegration between the physical and the spiritual.
Wow, okay, so those are quite some interesting reviews. It's clear from those passages as well, I think, that Untold Night and Day provides a very out-of-the-ordinary reading experience, shall we say. Does that apply to Bae Suah's other novels as well?
Broadly speaking, I would say it does. Bae Suah has been publishing for about 30 years now, during which time she's gained a reputation as a novelist who dispenses with most of the standard implements in the novelist toolbox. And what's most often remarked upon is that she doesn't appear to do any plotting, at least in the conventional sense. Now, while the stories she tells usually contain a variety of characters and events, many of them quite memorable, what those characters do and how those events occur is not dictated by a this happened, so that happened, and so that happened causality that we'd know from a genre novel. When reviewers invoke dream logic, as the Guardian pieces did, I think they mean that, much like dreams, Bae Suah's fiction feels as if it makes perfect sense while you're experiencing it. And only later, when you're trying to tell someone else about it, do you realize how difficult it is to explain it coherently when you're talking to someone else, let alone to convey the emotional or intellectual impact it had on you.
Okay, so when you say it's dreamlike, another feature of dreams is, of course, that anything can happen, anything imaginable can happen in them, no matter how absurd or unrealistic. Do we see that fantastical turn in the same way here in Bae's books here as well?
This is a point especially worth emphasizing. We don't see that there. We don't see that in these books. They're realistic books. I mean, judging by the content alone, rather than the form, you could actually call Bae Suah's work highly realistic. Her early stories that she was writing in the 90s or the turn of the millennium have what I'd call a modern Korean bleakness. You still see in quite a few writers here. And she hasn't lost that tendency entirely. But over the decades, the material she works with and the influences she's been taking in have become much broader, indeed more international. In the early 2000s, I believe 2002, she took about a year off work. She had a day job at a university back then and went to Germany, where she spent at least part of each year ever since. And thereafter, her work came to incorporate themes of not just travel, but also of perceiving and experiencing distant lands as an outsider. So over the same period, she's also become well regarded as a translator of German literature, handling the work of W.G. Sebald, Peter Handke, Robert Walser, Jenny Erpenbeck, Franz Kafka, and even a few years ago, this surprised me, the Diary of Anne Frank.
Wow, okay. Yes. So she's been heavily influenced then by European writings in recent years, then you're saying. Would it be going too far to even describe her as a kind of Europeanized Korean writer?
I don't think it would be wrong, and it's certainly one way I've considered her, not just in her sensibility and occasionally her actual settings, but also in her prose style. We should note most of her books so far published in English have been translated by Deborah Smith, who's best known for her work with Han Gang. She translated The Vegetarian, of course. Deborah has spoken of first discovering Bae Suah through an article in which an academic described her as, quote, doing violence to the Korean language. And I can understand how that would have made Deborah want to read Bae Suah as soon as possible. And in fact, it's fairly common to hear first-time Korean readers of her work, Korean readers, I stress, describe her language as unusual, even weird, even to some off-putting, to some quite the opposite. But as a non-native reader of Korean, I am no doubt sort of less sensitive to the ways in which Bae Suah violates standard usage, but any reader, no matter their facility with the Korean language, will take note of the ways in which she violates what I might call the rules of writing in general. Some fairly clear and characteristic examples arise in this new book, 속삭임, 우묵한 정원.
Right, we should state at this point that you're reviewing for us the book in Korean.
Yes.
This book hasn't been translated yet.
It hasn't been translated yet. It's fairly new.
Our, I guess, unofficial translation of the title would be something along the lines of maybe a whispering hollow garden.
I like that. I like that translation. They also, on this cover, they have the English words "whisper sunken garden" at the very bottom. So sometimes you see it referred to that way. I don't know if this is going to be accepted as an official English title. Yours is more grammatical, but sure, whisper sunken garden, whispering sunken garden, whispering hollow garden, something along those lines. Although I do note her books tend to get very different titles in English translation than they had in the original. So we'll have to pay close attention to what, if a reader wants to read this in English, it could be called anything, so watch out for that.
So this is the latest book from Bae Suah in Korean?
It's the latest book from Bae Suah in Korean. And the very beginning, in the very first chapter, its narrator receives a letter from someone she calls MJ, a stage actor who boarded at her house decades ago. Now, a protagonist who suddenly hears from a nearly forgotten figure from her past, that may be an entirely conventional way to get a story going. But Bae Suah does nothing conventional with it. The letter arrives on the narrator's birthday, which she thought no one knew, and it also appears to reference the impromptu trip the narrator is just about to take. So this sends her mind back into the past, recalling what she can of MJ, as well as all of the other boarders who stayed in her house way back when, all of which Bae Suah seamlessly interweaves with the narrator's meditations on a variety of periods, places, and experiences in her own life. Much as in a dream, each of these episodes connects logically to the next, if not with strictly narrative logic. One device employed here is the 속삭임, or whisper, of the title, an italicized voice in parentheses of mysterious provenance that occasionally appears to prompt the narrator with utterances that evoke different memories, which she then goes into, sort of delves into. Another slightly more subtle device will be familiar to longtime Bae Suah readers, and that is her repetition throughout the book of particular conspicuous words or phrases. Those who read Untold Night and Day may remember frequently encountering references to, and I quote, plain coarse-textured white cotton hanbok, or women described as having skinny calves corded with stringy muscle, pathetically small feet, and shoes that gleamed like new, yet looked like cast-offs, many times throughout the book. And here in this book, 속삭임 우묵한 정원, Bae Suah returns over and over again to 맨드라미, or coxcomb, a kind of luridly colored flower, to the image of a 반투명한 유리창, or translucent window, and even to the word 속삭임 itself, which appears in a variety of literal and metaphorical contexts.
Okay, so very, should we say, colourful indeed. So you've put that as an example of her literary, I guess, rule-baking that you were mentioning earlier, to the extent of letting the reader notice frequent reuse of certain phrases and images, which is something a novelist would normally avoid. But she seems to be doing it deliberately, and indeed so deliberately that it becomes an element of her style as such. I guess my question is, how do you think she makes that work? Because I fear it may have failed with others.
It's not a safe strategy necessarily. I do get the impression that, like her sensibility as a whole, this works very well for some readers and not at all for others. And you can confirm that by looking at the reviews of 속삭임 우묵한 정원 posted by bookstore website users, the vast majority of whom give it the highest possible marks, and the rest of whom give it the lowest possible marks. No one, not a one in the middle. And if one is either pro-Bae Suah or anti-Bae Suah, I myself am definitely pro-Bae Suah. And for me, it's always impressive to see how she can shape her fiction in this almost cyclical way, managing to return to her chosen motifs every time from a new direction and with a new meaning. It forces you to experience her books in a different way than you would the work of other normal, shall we say, writers. Now, earlier I mentioned that this new novel involves a narrator who decides to take an unplanned trip, or to travel 즉흥적으로, as she puts it in the original Korean. That's not the most common word in the language. As I recall, I only learned it myself when I first went to see some 즉흥극, or improv theater, as we'd say in English. But it appears quite often in 속삭임 우묵한 정원, and I've also noticed it popping out of the text in other Bae Suah books before. This isn't the first time this word has popped up a lot in her work. I suspect there is a sense in which she works in a kind of improvisatory fashion, shall we say? Not that she just writes whatever comes to mind and calls it a novel, but that she writes according to spare and strict rules and structures that allow the resulting narratives to take their own shapes, which the reader, and indeed the writer, I imagine, could never have predicted.
Indeed, I guess it means the reader has to be prepared to go on a sort of journey and let Bae pull you through her mind as such, but at the same time you can come back later and pore over the details, trying to unlock its hidden depths as well. She certainly sounds like one of a kind writer, and it's certainly a different side of Korean literature as well. We'll see if Deborah Smith or anyone else tries to take on the challenge of translating this latest work in English as well. But for now, we can appreciate it in its original Korean. Once again, it's called 속삭임, 우묵한 정원 by Bae Suah, and that was our pick for Korea Book Club this week. Colin, thank you for that review. We appreciate it as always, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Jung-ho. Looking forward to next time.
And that is where we wrap up our show today. Join us again tomorrow as we continue to bring you the latest headlines from Korea, analysis of key headlines. Till then, we hope you have a great day. I've been your host, Kwon Jang-ho, and thank you as always for listening. Goodbye.